Today we're diving into 21 alternative explanations for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Some of these are intriguing, while others sound like they were cooked up at 3 a.m. on Reddit. I'm saving the spiciest one for the end, and while I originally thought this would rank among the lowest, I was shocked at just how well it held up. And yes, I'll be ranking the resurrection hypothesis itself against all of these at the very end. As we begin, I'll just outline my methodology.
I'm something of a scientist myself.
I'm not going to do a full college lecture on each theory. This is more of a drive-by analysis based on a handful of core facts historians mostly agree upon. A good hypothesis will best explain the following. Jesus was killed by crucifixion. His tomb was found empty. The disciples appeared to become convinced that they saw him alive again in the flesh. They were so sold on this that they were brutally persecuted and even went full martyr mode without recanting their story. Their message spread fast and early. Even skeptics like James and especially Paul joined the squad, and the whole thing weirdly lines up with Jewish typologies and alleged prophecies like Isaiah 53, Psalm 22, the story of Jonah, the attempted sacrifice of Isaac, etc. Personally, I like that last one a lot because it makes a majority of these alternatives rank lower, but it gives a bit of a boost to the stronger ones. Anyway, let's kick it off with a classic, a pre-crucifixion conspiracy. Oh, and before I forget, I've hidden some Easter eggs in the video. See if you can spot them all and let me know below. Alright, a pre-crucifixion conspiracy. This suggests that Jesus and his disciples planned a fake death and resurrection beforehand. Now, this would well explain the early proclamation. It would explain the matching of prophecies to it because they're making this up ahead of time. They're planning it. They're looking through the Old Testament and they're saying, okay, we've got to make it look like this. However, this has some problems. It wouldn't well explain the real death of Jesus on the cross. After all, why would Jesus agree to do that? And why would Judas off himself? Perhaps Judas was killed by the others for attempting to rat them out? But again, Jesus going through all of that would be very bizarre. I'll come back to that in a second. You also have the transformation of the disciples that isn't well explained. Why are they dying for a lie? Why are they being brutalized when there's no evidence that they gained anything from this other than persecution? You also have the conversion of skeptics. That doesn't get explained here. They're not in on the conspiracy, so why would they convert? And then, again, coming back to the crucifixion, you can't really fake a crucifixion. But let's just say that they did plan for him to die by crucifixion to match the prophecies. Well, here you have a good explanation of one thing, which is that Jesus quotes Psalm 22 on the cross, which is a prophecy of him dying on the cross. So that would explain Jesus doing that. But again, if Jesus is really in on this, there would be way better ways to fulfill prophecies like that one. For instance, he could just have someone pierce his hands and feet with a sword, like in John Wick 3. Why does he need to be flogged and crucified? If you don't actually have the power to raise yourself from the dead, then you're just going to die a brutal death. You're not going to get any fame or glory out of it, and even if you did, you wouldn't be around to experience it. And this Jesus that supposedly does rise from the dead only sticks around for like 40 days, and then he just disappears. Why wouldn't he continue to accept worship and things like that? It doesn't really make a lot of sense. I'm going to put pre-crucifixion conspiracy in C tier. It's not terrible, but it's got some problems. Then we have post-crucifixion conspiracy. This says that the disciples made it up after Jesus died. This one makes better sense. This is a better one because it explains the empty tomb if they were the ones who moved the body. It again explains the early preaching. However, it doesn't really explain the transformations of these people and their consistency and sincerity in martyrdom, right? Why are they being persecuted for a lie? Why would no one squeal?
I know the squealers when I see them.
They had no motive to continue the lie after severe persecution, and they didn't gain power, money, women, fame, or anything else for this claim. Again, you still have the skeptic conversions, and its downfall is the connection to prophecies. You don't have the ability to explain why it lines up with these prophecies so well. Is it a coincidence? Maybe. But I think it's still better. I'm going to put it in B tier. Then you have what's called the prestige or stagecraft theory, named after the movie The Prestige. This says that Jesus maybe used lookalikes or misdirection or sleight of hand or some sort of stagecraft to fake his death and resurrection.
How about a magic trick?
This would explain his appearances after allegedly dying. Again, it explains the early beliefs. However, it doesn't explain real death. It doesn't explain his physical trauma, right? He doesn't have access to convincing makeup like we do today. It wouldn't really explain the skeptics' conversions. And again, Jesus was known for doing signs and wonders, even by critics like Josephus or the Talmud. But how does one fake a crucifixion? It's not exactly like pulling a rabbit out of a hat. A trick of this sort would require some sort of help from his enemies, like the Roman soldiers, implicating a big conspiracy. And then, of course, first century magicians didn't fake coming back from the dead with convincing scars and breakfast. The crucifixion was not a fiction.
What did I tell you about puns?
I'm going to put this one in D tier. I think it's pretty bad. All right, fourth, maybe the disciples conducted a seance, or there was some sort of occult explanation behind this. Maybe they tried to contact Jesus' spirit via supernatural means or rituals. They might have had paranormal experiences and interpreted them as Jesus returning. There's kind of a big problem here, though, which is that historical sources don't support anything remotely like this, and the resurrection accounts are about physical presence, not ghostly vibes. Furthermore, while Jesus updated their understanding of Jewish theology, there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that Jesus taught the disciples that witchcraft, necromancy, or communing with the dead was anything but sinful. The Old Testament, which they followed, makes it very clear that such practices are forbidden and even punishable by death in their community. Furthermore, this doesn't explain Paul's conversion, even if one postulates that the disciples disobeyed their original religion and maybe Jesus secretly taught them this stuff, or maybe they disobeyed it out of grief and desperation and they just wanted to see Jesus again, so they contacted a witch or something like that. Someone like Paul would have absolutely no reason to do this. Paul described himself as a Pharisee of Pharisees. He would have been extremely strict in his religion. He would have never done something like this. And in fact, Paul even later claims, as a leader in the Christian community, that practices like this will send you to hell. So that sounds pretty bad. This would explain the perceived appearances, kind of, but it wouldn't explain the physicality of the encounters they had, like touching Jesus or seeing him eating. It wouldn't really explain the empty tomb. They could still go there and see the real body. It wouldn't explain their transformations very well and why they martyred themselves for this. And it wouldn't explain the conversion of skeptics. I'm going to put this one in D tier. I think it's pretty bad. All right, stolen body theory. This is kind of popular. Maybe others moved the body and claimed there was a resurrection. This would explain the empty tomb. Again, you'd have to say that someone was able to get past Roman guards and move the stone and take the body and hide it with no one knowing, but okay, sure, it could explain the empty tomb. It would explain the early preaching of the disciples, and it would show that the disciples were sincere, right? They looked and there wasn't a body. However, this doesn't explain the post-mortem appearances, right? You can get rid of the body, but who is this showing up to begin with? Maybe the disciples were the ones to move the body, and maybe you say they made it all up, although we already covered that a little bit. And then there's a problem with motive. Why would someone else steal the body? Like, are they trying to build a Frankenstein's monster? Like, what are they doing with the body of Jesus? Why are they doing that? Why are they going and attacking Roman guards and moving a stone and grabbing this? Why are they doing that? And then you have the skeptics' conversions. Again, here we see one problem with many of these alternatives, which is that they either explain the empty tomb really well, or they explain the post-resurrection appearances very well, but they rarely get both. So I'm going to put this in C tier. It's not horrible, but it's definitely not a great explanation. What about substitution theory? Jesus didn't die on the cross. Someone else was crucified in his place. Maybe it was Simon of Cyrene or Judas. This theory is popular in some Islamic circles because the most well-attested fact about Jesus is that he died by crucifixion, and their Quran, according to the interpretation of most Muslims, claims that he didn't die and he wasn't crucified, but was substituted.
Call an ambulance! Call an ambulance!
but not for me.
That's in Surah 4, 157. This has major issues. It has zero historical evidence. It does explain Jesus appearing after death, right? If he didn't die, then there he is. However, it doesn't explain the crucifixion, again, the most well-attested fact about him. It doesn't explain the disciples thinking they saw the same Jesus. It doesn't explain the historical consistency in the gospel accounts, and the origin of this claim comes from late texts from people who have no credibility to speak on this issue, and in documents that are clearly not meant to be taken as historical biographies. So I'm going to put substitution theory as D tier. Okay, but what if he had a twin, right? I mean, maybe there was a look-alike that really did look alike. Jesus had some unknown identical twin, or someone who appeared like him who popped up after the crucifixion. This would explain the appearances, but it has some flaws. Number one, how did this twin go unnoticed for Jesus' whole life? He would have to be unknown to most people, because if they knew about him, then they'd just say, oh, that's Jesus' twin. So he'd have to pop up at the last minute to make all of this work. Not to mention, there isn't any historical sources of this. There's no ancient sources that hint at this. We have stories of Jesus' birth, and there's no mention of twins being involved. The empty tomb, maybe you could explain it by saying the twin stole the body, but it wouldn't explain the wounds seen by the disciples. He's got all these wounds that they saw inflicted upon Jesus at the crucifixion. How did the twin, or the real Jesus, if the twin was the one who was crucified, how did they get the exact injuries of each other? That doesn't make any sense. Why would either Jesus or a lookalike suffer torture and death for a hoax, right? If they were both in on it, why would they do that? Maybe he got the idea after the fact, but then why does this Jesus lookalike stick around for a little over a month and then supposedly ascend into heaven, right? He disappears. Even if you want to say that he ran away instead of ascending, why not stick around, accept worship, and become a king of some sort? This doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? The motives don't pan out. I'm going to put this one in D tier. Bad historicity, bad motivation. All right, number 8, spiritual resurrection only. This is a better one. Jesus supposedly rose only in a non-physical sense. This would mostly explain the appearances, although again, not the physicality of the encounters. It would explain the skeptic conversions, mostly because, again, Paul alleges that he encountered Jesus Christ on the road to Damascus. Well, okay, maybe the spirit of Jesus appeared. This doesn't explain the empty tomb very well. Maybe the body disappeared miraculously. Again, the physicality of encounters. You have Paul speaking of a bodily resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15, which kind of pokes a big hole in this. I'll put it in B tier, but it seems like it would be simpler at this point to just take the physical evidence into account. This best explains the fact that Jesus got into a room while the doors were locked, as is reported in the Gospels, but other than that, it really doesn't seem to explain a lot. Let's move on to number 9. This one's a joke one. The Easter Bunny hoodwinked the disciples.
You've been hoodwinked, baby!
According to scholars at Looney Tunes University, the resurrection was actually a Black Ops mission carried out by the Easter Bunny. The Easter Bunny orchestrated the whole thing by hiding the body and walked around in a perfectly camouflaged chocolate decoy. He wore the hollow chocolate Jesus like a mech suit, and his motive? It was world domination.
Never gonna answer to anyone ever again!
Thinking they were eating scrumptious Cadbury eggs, the Easter Bunny actually had these disciples chomping on cadmium eggs. The resulting heavy metal poisoning induced pastel-colored hallucinations, so strong that even Big Chungus himself couldn't bring them back to reality. But instead of giving the Easter Bunny world domination, they ended up giving Jesus world domination instead. Well, this would explain the visual appearances, sort of. It would explain conversions of skeptics like Paul, but it wouldn't really explain the empty tomb, since bunnies can't move gigantic stones, take out Roman soldiers, or steal bodies given their petite stature. He'd have to go full were-rabbit mode to accomplish that, or enlist the help of the Energizer Bunny, but then there's a conspiracy, and it gets a close shave from Occam's razor. We also have Jesus eating and close-up examinations of his body by the disciples after his resurrection. Wouldn't they see that he's made out of chocolate? There's a consistency in the narratives. Why are they all hallucinating the same things? Cadmium also is not known to induce hallucinations, and it doesn't explain how a character that's unanimously believed to be fictional actually existed, and existed before it was invented, I might add, thus making this anachronistic and therefore impossible. I'm going to put this in F tier. It's pretty bad.
You've spoiled the surprise. Surprise!
And if you're a militant atheist, you're probably typing, still a better theory than a zombie Jewish carpenter. But we've got to move on. Next up is swoon theory. But this is your reminder to like and subscribe if you want more of this stuff, and click that bell. All right, swoon theory. This says that Jesus didn't actually die, he just passed out. That is to say, he swooned from exhaustion and blood loss, and then later recovered in the tomb and escaped. So, some big problems with this one. Roman executioners were really good at their jobs. You'd have to say that professional executioners did their job very poorly with this, which is quite unlikely, especially since Jesus got flogged in addition to his crucifixion. Jesus would have been in a horrific condition, not inspiring hope, and how exactly did a half-dead man unwrap himself, roll away a massive stone, and find a way to recover? You might say he didn't need to sneak past the guards, maybe he screamed and the guards rolled the stone away themselves, unwrapped him, brought him to a doctor. But again, this still runs into a few problems. While it explains the empty tomb and the post-crucifixion experiences, it doesn't explain his real death. This is one of the only theories that denies the most attested fact about Jesus, that he died on the cross. This is unanimously attested to by Jewish, agnostic, and atheist historical Jesus scholars, and alternative views to that are considered extremely fringe. Jesus, again, was flogged, crucified, left hanging for hours, stabbed, and slit open. Water and blood appeared to come out of his body, which is a sign of death. And even if he had somehow survived, he would have been in critical condition. Not exactly someone you'd mistake for a victorious, glorified, risen God-man. The disciples also would have been worshiping this half-dead man, which doesn't well explain their transformations. Wouldn't they suspect that he just survived? I think this one belongs in D tier. All right, here's another goofy one. Time travel. Jesus used time travel or met a time traveler to escape death or appear posthumously. This would explain his appearances, but it wouldn't explain the crucifixion trauma, right? Why does he have all these injuries? And if he did get crucified, it wouldn't explain why a time traveler would do that if he could just avoid it. It also has absence of historical technological evidence, and it seems extremely ad hoc. It's going to go in F tier. Apparently, though, that is an actual suggestion that people have made. All right, what about wrong tomb theory? The women and the disciples just went to the wrong tomb, and they found it empty and assumed that there was a resurrection. This theory is simple, and it doesn't require any lying or hallucinating. This would explain the empty tomb, kind of, but it wouldn't explain how the actual body likely would have been found. The Jewish authorities could have easily just pointed out the correct tomb. Joseph of Arimathea was a known person who owned the tomb. Also, it wouldn't explain the post-mortem appearances or the early widespread belief. Why is this news getting out when it's so easily debunked? I'm going to put this one in D tier. I think it's pretty bad. It's not the worst, but it's pretty bad. All right, 13. Legend theory. This one's actually a decent competitor. The resurrection story is a myth or a legend that developed over time. Myths pop up all over the place, including in other religions, so why not Christianity? This would explain the growth of the belief, and it would definitely explain the matching prophecies, right? I mean, if it's just a legend that kind of develops, people can just alter it to make it look like it matched stories in the Old Testament. Makes sense. However, it doesn't explain the early testimony as well. There doesn't seem to have been much time for this myth to develop, since 1 Corinthians 15 contains an early creed dated to within a few years of Jesus' death. Also, eyewitnesses were still alive and could have refuted the claims that were circulating at the time. That's not to say that myths can't develop quickly, but it seems difficult to do that when you've got people who could just say, yeah, that's not true. In any case, there's also the conversion of skeptics that goes around. Why would Paul convert? That doesn't seem to make much sense. The martyrdom or persecution of these eyewitnesses also doesn't make any sense. Why would they be brutalized for a lie, especially an undeveloped one? This theory's greatest strength, its vagueness, is also its greatest liability. On that same point is a lack of motive. They gain nothing of value from continuing the lie in face of persecution. What's the motive? Why are they doing that? And then, of course, the Gospels are not written like legends. They include mundane, embarrassing details uncharacteristic of fables and fairy tales. I'm going to put this in B tier, but it's going to kind of have an asterisk next to it. I like that it matches the prophecies, but there are some decent problems with it. All right, now we have Jesus mythicism. This theory is rejected by virtually all serious historians, including atheists. It's not merely some minority opinion, which would be respected within academia. It's actually considered fringe and unacademic. It has a lot of explanatory power, but its lack of historicity really hurts it. So it does explain the perceived experiences, right? Because it's just a myth. It's made up. Jesus never even existed. They're just making up a story. It's going even beyond a mere legend that develops about someone. It's just totally fabricated. So you've got perceived experiences that are explained, the empty tomb, the consistent physical reports of Jesus eating and being touched. You have matching of prophecies, of course. You have the sincerity of belief if you just say that the disciples and everything we know about them were also mostly myths too. However, it fails to match up with the early sources we have on this. Jesus appears to be a real person. Again, its greatest strength is that it just brute forces itself past most of the issues. Its greatest weakness, however, is that it does this by denying unanimously agreed upon historical facts. So, depending on whether or not you want to say that most history is garbage, you might put it higher. I'm just going to put it in D tier. I don't think it's F tier because it does explain a lot. It's probably one of the best explanations in some regard, but again, no one actually takes this seriously. So I'm going to put it down there. It explains that, but there's just too much evidence of Jesus actually existing. So it's going to go in D tier. All right, what about mass hypnosis? A group hypnosis event convinced many that they saw Jesus alive and well. Jesus' followers were unknowingly hypnotized into believing they saw him. Mass hypnosis, however, isn't real as far as we can tell. There are no known sources for this even being a practice in the area or at the time. It's also extremely ad hoc. You could use it for anything. I didn't murder that man. You're just hypnotized into believing I did it. You're not looking at me cheating on you, honey. You're just hypnotized. It's just ad hoc. It would explain the appearances, but it wouldn't explain the empty tomb. It wouldn't explain the physical nature of the appearances. It wouldn't explain the skeptics being converted. How are they getting hypnotized? I'm gonna put it in like F tier. It's probably like a D/F tier, but I'm going to put it in F tier. It's just very ad hoc. How are they getting hypnotized? That doesn't make a lot of sense. All right, a similar one is grief-induced hallucinations. Grief caused vivid, shared illusions of Jesus being alive. These shared delusions, however, are not known psychological phenomena, especially across multiple people, locations, and time periods. How do they all align with each other on what they're seeing? It would explain Jesus' death, it would explain the emotional appearances they're seeing, but the nature of the appearances would go unexplained. Why would the disciples be expecting Jesus to arise bodily? They'd be more likely to envision him in the bosom of Abraham, for example. It wouldn't explain the empty tomb. Where's the body? And then, of course, you have multiple people seeing the same thing. Hallucinations, again, are individual. They're not group experiences. And yet, Jesus appeared to groups. It also doesn't explain the skeptic conversions. Paul specifically was not grieved by Jesus' death. He hated Christianity, and I'm sure hated this alleged Christ himself quite a bit. He would not have been grieving. This makes no sense. I'm going to put it in D tier. However, The next theory is a little better. Drug-induced hallucinations. Okay, this would explain Jesus' death. It would explain the visual appearances for the most part. It wouldn't explain the empty tomb again. It wouldn't explain the group appearances, right? Why is there consistency in these narratives? Why are they hallucinating the exact same things simultaneously? And then the one thing that sticks out to me the most about this is why would they not wake up after the hallucinations and put two and two together? Gee, I just took psychedelics and now I saw my dead friend. We just ordered a pizza with extra mushrooms. We were having a pizza party and suddenly, whoa, Jesus is here, right? Wouldn't you put two and two together? Wouldn't you say, I must have been hallucinating since you just got done taking mushrooms or whatever the heck? It also doesn't explain the conversions of skeptics like Paul, right? Why would he be taking these substances? It doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm going to put it in C. It's a little better, but not by much. Then we have number 18, which is mental illness-induced hallucinations. This theory suggests that the resurrection experiences were the result of mental disorders among Jesus' followers, particularly schizophrenia, delusional psychosis, or other conditions that can cause hallucinations and false beliefs. These experiences were misinterpreted as literal appearances of a risen Jesus. However, we don't have any evidence from the writings by or about these people that they exhibited any sort of symptoms of mental illnesses other than the very thing that's up for debate. So it seems pretty ad hoc to me. And that's not wrong. It's not wrong to say, hey, look, this sounds delusional, so maybe they had mental illnesses. That's fine. But you might need more than that, and you're still going to run into some problems. But first, let's talk about what it explains. It explains the death of Jesus on the cross. It explains the visual appearances for the most part, and it explains the sincerity of martyrdom. There are people with mental illness who really believe they're seeing what they claim to be seeing. However, it doesn't explain the empty tomb. It doesn't explain group appearances. Again, how are they seeing the same thing? There's consistency in these narratives. There's conversions of skeptics. Why would Paul also have a mental illness, right? Maybe you could say, oh, Jesus got mentally ill people to follow him. Well, Paul was not a follower of Jesus, so why would he do that? Why would he have a mental illness coincidentally? And then lastly, why wouldn't their opponents just call them delusional? This one's going to go in D tier, along with grief-induced hallucinations. In summary, with grief and mental illness, you have the benefit of not being tipped off to the origin. And with substances, you at least have the highest possibility that everyone, including Paul, was taking them. With grief, you have everyone except Paul, but with mental illness, the likelihood that they all had mental illnesses of this type would be astonishingly low. Sure, you could combine these three theories, but no matter what, you run into the problem they all share, which is that they all saw the same thing simultaneously, and that doesn't happen with hallucinations. All right, 19. Drugged and revived theory. This is a pretty good one. Jesus was given a drug to fake death and was later revived. Perhaps they gave Jesus a substance in the vinegar offered to him on the hyssop branch on the cross. That made him appear dead, but he later recovered. Now there's the problem that this requires an unlikely conspiracy involving both enemies and followers, and it still doesn't explain the survival of the flogging, crucifixion, stab, and slash trauma. It would explain the empty tomb, but again, how do we get past him surviving the crucifixion? Even with great medical attention, that would be very unlikely, even with today's medical advancement. Assuming the disciples weren't in on it, his physical condition certainly wouldn't inspire belief, and if they were in on it, that might slightly explain medical attention, but wouldn't explain why they died for what they knew to be a lie. And why not keep Jesus' survival a secret so he isn't killed again? And if he's alive, why share the gospel without him present? Why does he disappear after 40 days? Wouldn't you want to go around and become famous? I'm going to put this in B tier, but I mean, man, you could almost put it in C. You could almost put it in C. I'm going to put it in B. We'll just put it there. Then we have alien involvement. Maybe aliens rescued Jesus, or revived him, or staged the resurrection.
Buzz-looking alien! Where?
This would explain the post-crucifixion appearances. However, it's total speculation with no historical basis. There's no motivation. It's strange why it would match up with prophecies, right? Why would aliens use Jewish messianic frameworks? Why would they even care about that? And yeah, there's just no evidence for this. There we go, F tier. All right, the next theory is shockingly good, in my opinion. But if you've made it this far, subscribe if you haven't already. All right, 21, demonic involvement. Maybe demons deceived people by creating visions or manipulating matter. This would explain the apparent resurrection. It would explain early belief. It would explain the motivation if another religion is in fact true, right? That demons would want to divert our attention away from that true religion. It would explain the skeptics' conversions, of course. That's demonic as well. But it would fail to explain a lot of other stuff. So you've got the empty tomb, unless the demons somehow moved the body. Also, this requires a prior belief in demons and that Christianity is unlikely to be true based on other arguments. You also have the weird part about it matching Jewish prophecies. So like if Judaism is the true religion, they're trying to get away from Judaism, why would they do something that looks like it fulfills prophecies? Maybe you could say, well, they're trying to divert our attention to a false Messiah and there's going to be a real Messiah later, so they're trying to get ahead of it. Okay, maybe that could work. But then why wouldn't God warn the Jews about this false demonic Messiah that's going to come first and convert the entire planet to his false religion? Christians believe that God has warned them about the coming Antichrist before Christ's actual return. Why wouldn't God do that for the Jews? That doesn't make any sense, especially if he's going to convert tons of Jews and create the biggest false religion ever. That seems kind of weird. Also, demons in many religions don't have the power to raise people to life. Only God does. So you'd have to say something else happened here. Also, why would demons be motivated to raise a guy who told us to love our neighbor and pray for our enemies? Jesus seemed to be a pretty good guy who had great moral teaching. Wouldn't there be more evidence of him teaching demonic things? That's what you find with Muhammad in Islam, for example, if you look at it from the framework of Jewish and Christian teachings. I'm going to put this in A tier, but it's going to be there with an asterisk because, again, it really requires you to have a lot of prior beliefs. If you're an atheist, this will definitely not be your go-to. This will be way down on the list. But if you're a Jew or maybe a Muslim, this theory might sound appealing. However, if you're a Muslim, for example, you'd have to explain why your religion sounds so much more demonic. Check my episode out on the sinister superstitions of Islam for more on what that means. And if you're Jewish, you'd have to explain why the Talmud says Jesus is burning in hell in feces while the rest of the world thinks Jesus is a pretty chill dude. I mean, again, maybe that's just demons tricking us all, but whose view sounds more demonic? That just seems kind of weird. So it's like A tier with an asterisk. Maybe you think it's a little lower, but I had to have something up here. All right, stick with me because there's still one to go. Before we weigh the pros and cons of the resurrection, let me know in the comments which theory you actually think holds water, or which one gave you an existential crisis. Otherwise, if you've got a theory even weirder than aliens, time-traveling Jesus, or an Easter Bunny Black Ops mission, I want to see it. Blow my mind in the comments. All right, the true physical resurrection. This explains Jesus' death by crucifixion. It explains the empty tomb. It explains the apparent resurrection of a physical Jesus with authentic battle damage.
With authentic battle damage!
Batteries not included. It explains the transformation of the disciples and their willingness to die for this belief. It explains how early this was preached. It explains the skeptics' conversions. And it explains the alignment with alleged Jewish prophecy. However, some might accuse this video of being biased, since the criteria selected set the crucifixion up for the W from the very beginning. You can make a lot of stuff sound true if you just leave out facts or arguments that oppose your view, and that's not really fair. So let's go over a few skeptical attacks on the resurrection to see if it still holds up to scrutiny. So we've got things like Hume's theory, right? This idea that a natural explanation is always superior to a miraculous explanation. However, this belief is unfalsifiable.
That's fair. That's real fair.
And if you already believe in God or the possibility of divine action, a miracle is not off the table. This view would not be the best view for accumulating knowledge about whether miracles happened, since it basically just says miracles are never the best explanation. At most, it can always be the second best explanation, but it can't be the best. If God actually parted the clouds and spoke to us right now, in reality, he actually did it. It wasn't just a vision or anything like that. God actually did that. Hume would say that we still couldn't believe it. That makes no sense. That doesn't get us to the truth, because the truth is that God actually did the thing.
All men and women created by you know the thing.
So that's a bad theory. Some might say these documents are theologically motivated. The authors weren't recording what happened, they were trying to inspire these new Christian people to believe. However, even biased sources can be historically reliable. Ancient historians like Josephus and Tacitus had biases too, but that doesn't mean they invented the events that they report. Well, what about the fact that there are no contemporary non-Christian accounts of the resurrection? No Roman or Jewish historians in the first century confirm the resurrection. If it really happened, shouldn't it have made bigger waves? There are indirect references in Tacitus and Josephus's works, and early creeds in Paul's letters like 1 Corinthians 5, 3-8. Also, resurrection might not have been a politically or culturally important event to non-Christians at the time. And of course, if you were a non-Christian who became convinced that Jesus rose from the dead, you would no longer be a non-Christian. And therefore any source you write on the matter would no longer be a non-Christian source. It's sort of like saying, all the people who tell us that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves were people who believed that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. Well, of course they weren't, right? And then finally, someone might say that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The claim that a man came back from the dead is extraordinary. And the evidence for it, mostly secondhand stories decades later, isn't extraordinary enough to justify belief. However, it could be argued that a combination of the empty tomb, eyewitnesses, sudden transformation of the disciples, and the rise of Christianity is rather extraordinary, and points best to a literal resurrection. And if beating about 20 other competing hypotheses isn't extraordinary, I don't really know what is. But regardless, I would just say that at a basic level, claims require sufficient evidence. And I think there is sufficient evidence for the resurrection. S tier. And by the way, if you find this stuff entertaining or informative, subscribe to help a brother in Christ out. I make both goofy and serious Christian content. Check these videos out for more.